Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 1, Episode 9. In this podcast, we talk to pagans, witches, druids, shamans, and more about their past and how they live in the modern world. Who are the druids? What do we know of the druids, and do they still exist? Today I'm speaking with Kristoffer Hughes, who is the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order, a Mount Haemus Scholar, and a member of the Orders of Bards, Ovates and Druids, which I am also a member of. He is a teacher, writer, workshop leader, and guest speaker at pagan conferences, camps, and festivals throughout the United Kingdom, Europe, and North America. Kristoffer has also contributed to Welsh and English television and radio. He's the author of 4 books and the creator of the Celtic Tarot. He worked formerly for Her Majesty's Coroner service and has also taught Death Midwifery. He lives in the Isle of Anglesey, just off the northern coast of Wales. His newest book, The Book of Druidry, will be out this year. I'm going to take you now to this conversation. Welcome to the Calling the Quarter podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today, I'm so happy to be talking with Kristoffer Hughes, who's a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, and he's also the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order. He's also a very prolific author. We're going to be talking about his books today. Kristoffer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dean. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Yes, very well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kristoffer. I live on a small island just off the northern western coast of Wales, the island of Anglesey, or Ynys Môn in my native language. Anglesey was the last stronghold of the British Druids. There was an enormous battle here in 62 AD when the Romans marched all the way from Londinium, London, to destroy or sack the Druid stronghold of Ynys Môn. But we're still here and we didn't go anywhere. The Romans may have come and messed with us, but we're still around even to this day. And I head the Anglesey Druid Order, which serves to honor not only the ancestors of the past and the memory of Druids on Anglesey in the past, but also rekindles that ancient seat of learning and makes it applicable and appropriate and contemporary, makes it contemporary for the modern day.
I want to talk about your life a little bit. I really loved reading your bio and reading up on you, and really was fascinated by different parts of your life, which also affected, I think, some of the books you wrote. I used to work for Her Majesty's Coroner service for a while. You retired in 2021. Can you talk about this work and how it impacted your spiritual life?
I did. I worked for His Majesty's Coroner service for a long time, for 32 years. And that basically means that I worked at public morgue facilities throughout the United Kingdom, not just in one location. But the twilight years of my career, if you like, were here. I served the dead here in Northwest Wales. And I was always drawn to that work ever since I was a child. I knew that somehow I would end up working in the death services professions. And I trained in anatomical pathology back in the very early 1990s. And that was my life for the last 32 years. And working with the dead informed my spirituality, but my spirituality also informed the way in which I did that work. Because I'm sure you can imagine it's a pretty intense environment where people are in the sufferance of acute grief. Usually they've only just found out that a person has died, sometimes very tragically. And we're the first point of contact, the first people that they see. And people require comfort, answers, all of the existential stuff comes to the fore at that very moment, whether they've been religious or had absolutely no interest in religion at all. Suddenly at that moment in time, all this existentialism comes to the fore, and they need somebody to be with them, to guide them through that. And as a druid, that certainly helped me to help other people see through their grief, but also helped me to adjust to the aspect of the work that, I mean, the only word for it is horror. That there's an aspect of it which is horrifying. The cruelty of mankind, the way in which people meet their demise. So it helped me on so many different levels, but also being in that world bled through into my spirituality as well and informed I suppose, made me the kind of druid that I am today. And I'm very fortunate, and I feel very privileged to have had that experience, but also to be in service to my various communities at their darkest hour, at the worst times of their lives, and to ensure that the dead were safe, that the dead had a voice through me, and if any injustice had been done to them, that would come to light and people would be caught to justice for any wrongdoings. So it was a very complex, multi-layered profession, and it seems quite incredulous now that I've not done it for a year and a half, and it's been such a vital component of my life for so long. But it was time after the COVID-19 pandemic, which was an extremely traumatic time for all of us that worked in death services.
Oh, yeah.
I realized it was time to move on, time to focus on other things, focus on my creativity before it's too late, because we're not here for a very long time.
No.
We have to make the most of it. And if working in death services has taught me anything, is grab life by the neck and
Absolutely.
Embrace it and live it before somebody closes a refrigerator door on you.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, at what point did you begin your path of paganism, and when did this start for you?
I think it kind of ran hand in hand with my professional life, with my career. But as a child, I was always sensitive and aware of other things within the material, apparent world that evidently the friends around me, the family around me were not. They were either not interested or they didn't perceive these things. Whereas I was extremely sensitive to the natural world around me, even almost, I didn't have the word for it then, but to the animistic principle that was inherent in nature. I found that I sought succor and counsel and peace in the woods behind my grandma's house. And to other children of my age, the woods were creepy. They were spooky, which I guess to an extent, it's a little ancient woodland with gnarly old oak trees. And I suppose it can appear somewhat foreboding, but I loved being in there. I felt safe in there. I felt embraced by that principle, but I didn't have a name for it. And of course, the only option I had growing up as a child in 1970s Wales was Presbyterianism. That was about the only face of spirituality that was available to me. So I went down that road. I tried Christianity, but it just didn't quench a thirst. It didn't sing to my soul or to my spirit. But then I started to look and to listen to the land and to my culture. And slowly, as I grew up and as I grew in my awareness of spiritual things and matters, I was able to fuse elements from my cultural past, from my own past, from my landscape, from my history and heritage, and started to find my feet in an expression of spirituality that was very much a part of this landscape. And of course, it wasn't long, because I've always had an exposure to druids, but the very public face of druidry here in Wales is very much a cultural facet. It's not necessarily a spiritual function. That's not to say that those people don't have a spiritual function. Some of them certainly do, but its function is primarily for the preservation of culture and bardism and the arts and so forth. So I'd always had that exposure. And as I grew up and educated myself as to, well, who were the ancient druids, I realized that, actually, elements of that still persist in my culture through the bardic tradition and so forth. So by the time I got to my early 20s, I was able to place that name upon what I was feeling, doing. And then suddenly I realized that there was an entire world out there in the English-speaking world that were practicing druids. And I had no idea they even existed, because we didn't have the internet. There weren't any, the books that we now have access to, they weren't there at the end of a keyboard. These things had to be sought and hunted down. And it was a process that took a long time. And I guess that whole searching must have taken from the mid-80s towards the latter end of the 90s, I suppose, before I understood the nature of what my spirituality was, where it came from, what informed it, what inspiration was behind it, for me to be able to put the name Derwydd, Welsh for druid, upon it. And so it's been a bit of a roller coaster, you know?
I can imagine. When did you start working with the Druid orders?
So that was probably towards the end of the 1990s. And the largest Druid order here in the United Kingdom is the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. And I'm a Druid graduate of that particular order. So they've always been a part of the landscape. So it took, like I said, it took me a while to realize that these things were out there, that these things were valid expressions of a spirituality. So I've been a member now of OBOD for the past 20 odd years. But at the end of the 1990s, I also founded the Anglesey Druid Order, so that there was something in my locale. Again, no internet, there was no other way
Right.
for people to come together, for people to network. So we started our own tradition. And when I say we started our own tradition, it took us a while to find our feet within that tradition as well. And I guess we're still constantly trying to find our feet through progression and continuous development. So hopefully we'll be forever growing. So being a part of the Anglesey Druid Order roots me into locality and the space here, to my square mile, if you like. And then being a part of something like the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids means that I'm also connected to a global network of druids who all sing from the same hymn page, pardon the pun. And so it's lovely. So there's a locality specific element to my druidry, but then there's also this global component that comes through the OBOD. And I'm very grateful for both of those things. They bring an enormous amount of color, diversity, and inspiration to my life, but also to my spirituality. So it's rather fabulous.
I always like to ask people who are from England, because when we study, when I say me, I mean Americans. When we study Druidry or paganism, we're always talking about England and Ireland and Scotland, and we're thinking about it. We read the myths. It's very much a part of our lives. But for you, you kind of walk the same ground. You live in the same places. This is part of your life and who you are. How must that be for you? I always want to ask people about that because I mean, I live in California, which like the oldest structures are maybe 200 years old. And
Yeah.
we're a baby country in many aspects, whereas England has been, you have Neolithic sites, etc. What is that like for you?
Well, for one thing, England is another ball game. I live in Wales, so different country.
Yeah, very true.
So we have our own cultural expression here that's very, very separate and very different to the English cultural continuum. So not only do we have this stream of linguistic culture that ties me to my ancestors from the deep past, because if you go back 2,000 years to the last one of the last golden ages of the Druids, they spoke a language called Brythonic or Common Brittonic or Common Celtic. And my language, my first native language, is Cymraeg, Welsh, is a descendant of that language. So just the heritage and the history of the language itself connects me to this stream, this river that has within it the memory of the Druids. Now, we don't exactly know what they did. We know some stuff from the classical authors, from the archaeological record, from mythologies, stuff that we can piece together. But they all exist within this stream, within this linguistic cultural stream. So that's one source of beautiful inspiration that comes from the very land itself, from the tongue as well. But then we have these structures and these places which tie us into a very apparent physical dimension of spiritual expression. And one of the places here on the Isle of Anglesey is a monument called Bryn Celli Ddu, which means the mound in the dark grove. And that's a 5,000-year-old structure that is aligned to the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And if anyone out there has ever watched we live stream our winter and summer solstice rituals, and we live stream them from this location. And it's incredible because when we go there, when we perform ritual there, when we work with this incredible monument, we're very much aware that we're a part of her community. Ironically, we're the least permanent part of her community. She's been there for 5,000 years and will more than likely be there for tens of thousands of years to come. But to see the phenomena of the rising sun at the morning of the solstice happening within the heart of that chamber is to see something in the same manner, in the same place as our ancestors did 5,000 years ago. And that does something to you. It moves you in a way that is very, very difficult to articulate. So these things, all these different facets, certainly connect me to the land, to the expression of spirituality that I claim through Druidry. But there's also more. There's the natural world as well, and I'm very lucky. I've been to California several times, and whilst as a culture you may be very new there, you only have to go to somewhere like the Santa Cruz Mountains or to Arnold and see these trees that are thousands of years old. That the native spirits of the land that you live on, you can perceive them in these ancient giants. And to me, that is just as magical as the 5,000-year-old man-made chamber that I've got at the bottom of the garden. There's still that very vibrant, energetic thing that you can touch, you can feel, that connects you to the song of the land that you live on, whether it's man-made or naturally manipulated out of the earth itself, or if it's a whacking big 400-foot tree that stood there for 3,000 years. I think all of those things have the ability to cause us to connect to the song of the land itself, which is what I believe Druidry does, that its function is to connect us to the song of the land, so that hopefully we become oak-wise, as the word druid implies, and that we become infused and imbibed with wisdom through the expression of our spirituality, And I'm very lucky. I never take for granted the fact that we have these incredible places here that our ancestors built, not just for them. We have very little trace of how these people lived. Places like Bryn Cellithi has hardly any signs of how those people lived, but they left us these signs for how they revered, how they may have worshipped, what principles of nature that they seemed to have been attracted to. And as far as I'm concerned, they didn't build those for the past. They didn't build them for the present. They built them to last, which implies that they built them for us. They built them for us, and they built them for the us of 400 years in the future and the us of 1,000 years in the future, that these things are there for the future. And for us as modern day druids, or whoever those people were in the deep past, I think any spirituality that's worth its mettle is a tradition that serves to seed the future with wisdom, and that these places act as focal points in which we can glean our wisdom and also disseminate that wisdom out into the world. So there's a lot going on, in the British Isles when it comes to ancient monuments. But I think people might be remiss to consider that these things are just relics. I think to consider them as relics does a disservice to the past, because they're very much alive. These things are living monuments. They have attitude, they have personality, and we relish in being in their company. And we're very lucky to be in their company, just as you are very lucky to be able to walk into a forest where there are ancient creatures that have seen pasts that we can't even imagine.
Yeah. I like to talk to my guests about their lives as a druid or pagan or whatever name they want to use, and how it kind of integrates with their daily life. And I know for myself, I live in the Bay Area, which is a very okay place to be open about your spiritual practice. I mean, sometimes you encounter some pushback, but normally it's a pretty safe space. Other parts of the America you can imagine are not so, friendly, like the South, Midwest, etc.
Mm.
What's it like living as a druid in Britain on a day-to-day basis? Do you ever encounter any issues with family or friends or coworkers where you have issues where people either don't take you seriously or they're against what you do?
So we're very fortunate here, especially in Wales. We're extremely fortunate, and it's a really peculiar thing, because if you bring to mind an image of the British Isles, you can literally fit the British Isles into one of the American Great Lakes. It's not a massive area.
Yeah.
And Wales is very, very small. We're only about 190 miles long. And I think at our widest, we're about 90 miles. And we have a population of 2.7 million people. But there is this invisible line that denotes a delineation between Wales to the west and England to the right. And that delineation, that line, is defined by the use of a common tongue. So here in Wales, the term derwydd, meaning druid, is very much culturally accepted and celebrated within our culture. So when I talk to somebody about being a druid, they already have a cultural understanding of what that means. And it comes with the vision, the image of somebody who has, the Welsh word for it is irddas, or somebody who is irddasol, which roughly translates very poorly into dignity and dignified. So they have this sense that that person, that tradition, has within it something that's very dignified, very respected, and people generally have a profound respect for the figure of a druid. And then, of course, the channels of dialogue are open then for further discussion, where I can explain the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of the spirituality of Druidry as something that you do, not just something that you believe. But when you cross the border into England, the word druid in the English language has a very different connotation. It seems to be more easily and readily accepted into the common vernacular than perhaps the word witch. We don't have a word for witch in the Welsh language. The word that we have is a very poor equation, and it doesn't translate very well. But in England, I find that when I go into England to give talks and workshops, or just talk to people in my professional capacity, there's intrigue. There's like, oh, a druid. I sort of kind of know what that is, but I'm not entirely sure. So I might ask you a few questions about it. And I find that most people are quite open, but it is a different perception. So here in Wales, the perception is quite different, because it's such an integral, I would say that perhaps a good way of describing it is that in Wales, just Wales, Druidry and Druids are endemic. They're a part of the very fabric of our society. And whilst we have two countenances to Druidry here, it already kickstarts a conversation. There's already a platform of understanding that comes with that term. And usually it's in relation to the Gorsedd of Bards of the island of Britain, which are the Druids of the cultural movement in Wales. But it starts a discussion. There's a point of reference that has foundation, that is concrete, and people can then develop from that in a way that is respectful and dignified. So we've been extremely lucky. I've genuinely not encountered any adverse reactions or any hostility. And we work as Druids with a Welsh government agency called Cadw, which is Welsh heritage. They look after our ancient monuments. So we work hand in hand with these people to host our rituals, to host events, and they respect us. They will consult with us if they feel that we can help them with anything. I work in the world of television, so I am out and open as a druid in that world. So people will often ask me to contribute to television or radio programs to talk about Druidry and spirituality. So I'm very, very lucky, and I'm aware from my frequent trips to other parts of the world that In some regions of the world, people aren't that fortunate. So I never take it for granted that I am very fortunate to live in an environment that is so accepting of who I am in relation to what I practice.
I want to talk a little bit about the Anglesey Druid Order. Can you tell us about it and your role there as the chief?
Yeah, sure. So the Anglesey Druid Order started in response to the fact that there wasn't any form of networking to be had here in Northwest Wales. We didn't have a community of like-minded pagan folk who could gather for celebrating the seasons or what have you. So we decided that we would do something, and we just started a very informal grove called Cilchawenydd in the 90s. And that evolved and developed into the Anglesey Druid Order because I was aware that it needed structure, it needed a foundation in which people could come, they could be immersed in the Druid mysteries that grew from this very land. I wanted to offer people something that was very much indicative of the place itself, of the memories of the ancient Druids, to honor the ancient Druids, but also to fully embrace components of Welsh mythology, the Welsh bardic tradition, as wisdom traditions, but incorporate them in such a way that we could take elements of our mythology, elements of the bardic tradition, elements of archaeology, language, and formulate and create a system, a mystery tradition, if you like, that is imbibed with those wisdoms. Because when people go looking for the wisdom within these native tales, myths, traditions, they can easily become befuddled because there's so much material, material.
Yeah.
There's just hundreds of thousands of books, parchments, manuscripts, and it's very difficult. It's a jungle of material. And the majority of it, 98% of it, is not available in the English language. It's all in the native language. So it needs somebody who is able to read that and can filter it and present a system, a wisdom tradition that has been gleaned out of that tradition. And that's what we've succeeded in doing. And it's taken a long time to be able to do that in a way that not only fills our cup, but also enables other people's cups to be filled with awen, with the Druid force of inspiration. So in essence, Druidry is always a response, I think. It's responding to something, either an inherent call from the land itself or from culture or from myth, but it's calling us to rise to become the wisest versions of ourselves that we can be, in the hope that that wisdom will inspire the future. And that's what we've tried to do through the Anglesey Druid Order, is to develop a wisdom tradition that is not only applicable to the 21st century, but one that honors the past without being stuck in it. We've come from the past. We don't have to recreate the past. That's not the point of the present. The point of the present is to move into the future. So we're not Celtic Reconstructionists because we don't need to be Celtic Reconstructionists because we're Celts.
Yeah.
So we're just Celts. When people will often say, oh, the Celts did this, the Celts did that. And I often think, oh, hold on a minute. We haven't gone anywhere. We're still here. We're still here. Don't kill us off just yet, by making us past tense. So we're still around. And so we don't feel that we need to reconstruct anything because we are here. We are people from here, and we're able to share that with the world, because whilst it's come from this land, its teachings and its wisdoms is applicable wherever you are in the world, anywhere in the world. So people are attracted to our courses, our online courses and such, because the wisdom can be transplanted. It can be taken, used wherever you are in the world, but it honors this wellspring of wisdom that came from the past, but has been made applicable for the present.
How have things changed for you since this organization was created? What has it been like for you, and what have you observed?
It's completely changed my life. Like, utterly. There isn't a single part of my life that resembles what it was in the 1980s. It's I think it's a very difficult thing to articulate because it's so much, it's ingrained into the very fabric of my spirit and of my living. Every thing that I do, all of my pursuits, all of my endeavors have this at its heart. And it is very much an expression of my life. So it hasn't just changed me as a person, it's also changed the way that I see the world, my place in the world, the place of Druidry in the world. It's changed everything. And it's done it very subtly and it's happened gradually. But the thing that I love about Druidry and being a Druid is that it continues to change me. It continues to inspire and evoke a spiritual awareness and expression within me that seems to always be refreshed and renewed with each retelling, with each ritual, with each year of teachings that we do at the Order. It has a vitality to it that I am in awe of on one hand and deeply love, admire and respect on the other. And yeah, it just changed everything. It's changed my entire life.
Your work is very prolific as a writer, and it's what I think a lot of people know you from. I want to address some of your work. You're very comprehensive. We can't address everything, but I want to kind of go through some of your books that I'm familiar with. So I want to talk about your first book, which was done in 2012, and that's From the Cauldron Born, Exploring the Magic and of Welsh Legend and Lore. Can we talk about this book and what it was like for you as a freshman effort as a writer to have that book come out for you?
That was quite incredible because I'd already written 2 books for a very, very small British publishing house. And the folktale myth that I discuss in that book is one particular myth folktale from Wales called Historia Taliesin, or the story of Taliesin, and how Taliesin, the prototypic bard, came into being from Ceridwen brewing a cauldron of awen, and 3 drops land on the thumb of Gwion Bach, and there's all these shenanigans that happen, and he transforms into the prototypic bard after Ceridwen consumes him in the shape of a hen. And that particular tale has been a cornerstone for so many Druid orders and people's initiatory transformations. And I wanted to delve into it in a way that I didn't think had been done from a native perspective before. And I thought that it could possibly help by having a native perspective, somebody who understands the source language and is able to perhaps offer little pearls of wisdom from it. And I was at a festival down in Sussex that my friend Dave the Bard and his wife Kerry Lee used to run twice a year for a number of years. And this was in, I think, 2009. And the theme of that particular camp was the chase that happens in the story of Taliesin's birth. And they were recreating it ritualistically. And after the ritual had taken place, everybody was enjoying some bardic shenanigans around the fire. And I was walking slowly around the fire in the shadow, so nobody could see me. And I was watching all of them. And I was just very much like in the moment, really relishing and enjoying watching this scene of people enjoying each other's company under a starry sky with a big bonfire, making music and poetry. It was so lovely. And it came to me at that moment that I needed to give something to the world that explored that particular myth folktale from my perspective. And so I wrote it, and it came very easily to me, and I really enjoyed the process. And because I'd been published by a British publishing house, I was nervous about sending it to somebody like Llywelyn Worldwide, but my partner convinced me and said, well, why don't you try? Because the worst they can say is no, and you just have to pick yourself up, get over it, and try something else. So I sent it in and they bought it, and much to my own amazement. You know? And so again, it was like when you asked, how has Druidry changed your life? And that was another one of those instances of Druidry changing my life, because as soon as I became published with Llywelyn, that completely changed my life. It opened doors to worlds I didn't even dream of, I didn't even know existed. And I got to travel to the United States, which I get to fairly frequently. And it enabled me to talk about something that I really loved, you know? And I was very aware, though, that it was merely the tip of the iceberg, and that there would be much more within that spectrum of expression. And that came then in 2020 with the publication of Ceridwen, which is essentially the follow-up to Cauldron Born, where I go much, much deeper into who she is as the witch goddess, as the mother of Awen, as the steerer of bards. But I was afforded more time and space to be able to go right into that particular archetype that's at the center of that body of mythology. And of course, pagans from all over the world, they kind of know who she is. Her name is on the lips of most people, but nobody had ever written a book about, the tale or her in a way that was entirely just about that particular subject. And that's what I wanted to do, not just as something that I would enjoy doing, but also as an act of service to Ceridwen and to Taliesin and the bardic tradition that brought us that material,
Yeah. I want to circle back a little bit to your work with Death Midwifery. In 2014, you published The Journey into Spirit, A Pagan's Perspective, which was later republished as The Last Leaf Falls. This was your first book dealing with death. Can you talk about your desire to publish this work and kind of what it meant for you being able to talk about this topic?
At the beginning, when I was saying how my career informed my spirituality informed my career.
Yeah.
And that is so much, it expresses so much about the very fabric of who I am. And I felt that I needed to express that in a way that hopefully would cause other people to not just see people through their grief, but to cause people to understand the functionality of grief and bereavement as an essential component of the human condition. And it's something that I'm intimately familiar with from a professional perspective, but also from the people that I've loved and lost. And I felt as if I needed to express my own grief and the connection that I had to bereavement and to death from a personal/professional perspective. Because being a death service professional doesn't mean that I'm immune to death and grief. In a way, it's almost insulting when death happens to a death service professional, because you feel as if you've devoted your entire life to death, and then it goes and takes away your best friend or takes your sister. And I remember being so angry when my little sister died. She died at 22 years old.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Because I felt as if I should have had some brownie points, for services rendered. And of course, it doesn't work that way. Death doesn't work that way. And I wanted the book to express not only the connection that I have and my understanding of death, but I also wanted to express the pain that I've suffered as well, because people can relate to that. People can relate to the painful, traumatic things that other people have experienced that they are either going through or have recently been through. And I wanted to write something that not only expressed my understanding of those things as a professional and as just an ordinary person who suffered grief, but how all of those things are articulated within my spirituality, and how my spirituality helps me to deal with the pain of loss and to have an understanding of, okay, so what happens to us when we die? Because ultimately, every spiritual tradition, every religion on the planet have essentially arisen because of that one simple question: what happens to us when we die? And and the revealed religions are very much cornerstones of that question, and they have, as a function of their expression, the desire to live your life in a particular way now, in order for you to live a life after death in a particular manner. Whereas the animistic and the polytheistic traditions, I think, are more about living in the moment here now, knowing that, well, you're going home anyway, so just enjoy where you are now.
Yeah.
And be here now. So all of those things were in the cauldron, if you like, of my own expressiveness, my own creativity, my professionalism, my own personal life. And I wanted to somehow stir that up and then offer it to the world in a way that might help somebody. And as I was writing it, it was a very difficult book to write as well, because I found that I was moved and crying, writing some of it. I'm very emotional writing it. But then I occasionally receive emails or letters from people who have been deeply moved by it, and it's really helped them. And that still comes as a surprise, because writing is such a lonely affair. It's you do it in isolation, and it's a very solitary pursuit. And then suddenly you get these affirmations that people were touched by it, and that moves me deeply, especially that book in particular, because I think it's so much of who I am. And if it helps somebody, then I think that I've done my job. Then I've succeeded in doing what I wanted to do. If only one person is helped by it, and I'm glad that it's helped. It's helped a few people, and I'm very humbled by that. I'm very moved.
This may be one of the, I don't think that I've seen very many publications for pagans or druids where people talk about something where you're helping somebody else go through something. It's very, I don't know, I may be wrong, but like this seems that is something that is very much missing and lacking. Was that part of your mind when you wrote it?
Yes, very much so, because there are there's a handful of publications out there, but in the early 2000s, when I was looking for material to deal with my own losses, there was Starhawk's The Pagan Book of Living and Dying. There was a couple of books, but there wasn't an awful lot, and I felt that I wanted to address that. And because there is a tendency, I guess, in a culture, that what authors like to write and what people like to read are a lot of the how-to books. And I write those, and I like writing those books. But I wanted to write something that was far more contemplative and addressed an aspect of the human condition in a way that can sometimes make people feel uncomfortable, because in the West, we're not great talkers when it comes to death and dying.
No.
And I think aspects of that even bleeds into a culture and other alternative communities. But I think we're much better at it now, to tap ourselves on the shoulder, on the back. We're much better nowadays at actually sitting down and talking and opening channels of dialogue when it comes to things like death. And I encourage people in my book and within our community here, that every Calan Gaeaf, Samhain, Halloween, we talk about it. And one of our rituals is, if I die between now and next Calan Gaeaf, next Halloween, this is what I want you as a community to do for me. So we're all kind of aware of what needs to happen, because having been a death service professional for so long, the biggest problems arise invariably because people never talked about it. So then Granny dies and nobody knows what to do. And then what happens? Everybody starts fighting, and it all just goes sour very, very quickly. And all of that can be avoided if channels of dialogue are open. So my book really focuses on that aspect as well towards the end of the book. Please talk about it, and talk about it with your communities and your families, so that people are aware, because you are going to die. There's no way around it. None of us are getting out of this alive. So
Yeah.
it's best to be prepared, and it's best to be to have things put in place for when the inevitable happens. So that was part of the reason of wanting to address death and dying from a pagan perspective, for sure.
And this leads to my next question, and this also deals with something that's my favorite topic. I love Halloween very much, and I know that it's a little bit different in Britain than in England, Wales, than it is here in America. I know because we've largely derived from a lot of those practices, but also we have our own. What can you tell us of the practice of Halloween as it's existed in the British Isles, and then if you can compare it with American Halloween and how we do it here?
I think there's definitely a crossover, because since television and probably, well, even towards the end of the 1970s, we certainly saw the Americanized flavor of Halloween was seeping over to here, and that was coming from our television screens. So the very standardized Americanized trick or treat tradition that still happens here. And we don't really see much evidence for that having existed in the folkloric practices of Wales in the past. But we do have folkloric practices when it comes to Halloween, or Calan Gaeaf, we refer it to, which means the Calends of winter. And there are so many practices which I really relish in doing every single year, from grave minding, where we tend the graves of our ancestors and cut the grass and wash the stones and lay new flowers. There's another practice that we do called Hel Bwyd Cenad Ameiru, or food for the messenger of the assemblies of the dead. There's a mouthful in English, where we bake little cakes, and the cakes are called solod. And they're essentially like flat scones with some saffron in them. So they're a very peculiar yellowy goldy color. And these are given to people who would come round knocking on the doors, singing songs. So similar to trick or treat, but the songs act almost as prayers for the dead, and they're rewarded with a cake. And one of those cakes they will take to the cemetery and they will offer to the dead. We have another tradition called the Hwchdi Gutta, or the tailless black sow, who hides in the shadows, and then she chases people from the cemeteries. And they will throw these solids on the ground to slow the progression of the sow, because she will catch the last person in line and devour them and take them to the other world, And so people will reenact these particular tales. But in our tradition, in the tradition of the Anglesey Druid Order, Calan Gaeaf is very much the time where we awaken the Mari Lwyd. The Mari Lwyd is a horse's skull attached to a pole. The jaw is animate, you can clack it, and there's a long, long white gown that covers an operator underneath. And this is an old tradition in Wales that's been going on for centuries. And it's usually seen around Christmas time and New Year, but we've incorporated it into our tradition where we wake her up as the Queen of Winter. And then she goes to bed at Hen Galan, or Old New Year, which is the 13th of January. And next year, 2024, the 13th of January actually falls on a Saturday. So there'll be all sorts of celebrations. So it's something that starts at Halloween and then it ends in the middle part of January. And the Mari Lwyd is very much an expression of the sovereignty of the earth, sovereignty of winter. We perceive her in the Anglesey Druid Order as a guise of the goddess Rhiannon, the horse goddess Rhiannon. But this time the horse it's a very peculiar symbol, because she's dead, but she's alive. She's alive in the streets with clacking jaws, but she's dead. And it's a very peculiar thing to see. And the operator underneath is deeply affected by the way people react to the Mari Lwyd. And I think she encapsulates the oral tradition itself, that the oral tradition can appear dead when it's just a book, a dense book in a language that you can't understand, or that most people can't understand outside of Wales. But it's alive if you give it voice. It's alive, but it can appear dead. We have all of these symbols in the Celtic cultural continuum, from the Mari Lwyd to the severed head of Bran the Blessed, that all I think, express the tenacity and the vitality of an oral living tradition by showing you something that appears dead, but when you start to engage with it, it's very much alive and vibrant. And so Calan Gaeaf, Halloween, is probably my favorite of all of the festivals.
Me as well, yeah.
I absolutely love it because there's so many things that happen. And here we celebrate it over 3 days. So each of those days has a particular focus. And usually in that mix, or the nearest Saturday to that mixture, the order will also gather as a community to celebrate and wake up the Mari Druid. So it just goes on and on. It's fabulous. I love it.
I want to talk about your newest book now. And I'm very excited to talk about. I've been able to read it, and I'm really gobsmacked by it. I think it's wonderful. It's the Book of Druidry, which is the complete introduction of the magic and wisdom of the Celtic mysteries. And this work is a foundation on Druidry and a development of personal work. What did you want to do with this book when you began to write it? What were you kind of envisioning for it?
I think, oddly enough, all of the books that I've written, apart from my first one, which was a small publishing house, it's not easily available. All of my titles have been, I guess, Druid adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
No, they've not been explicitly druidic, if you like, or none of them have had the word Druidry in their titles. And I think during the pandemic, I sort of sat with myself and thought, why haven't you written a book about Druidry? Isn't that the most obvious thing that you should write? And I kind of had to have a word with myself about it. I thought, oh yes, that's true. And this dialogue was happening. It's like, why haven't I have been around the block a few times now in that world? And I felt that it was time to actually sit down and write a book specifically about Druidry. And then I thought of, I had this lovely, lovely, lovely friend. She was she was just such a delight. Her name was Myfanwy, such a Welsh name. She was such an amazing character. And she died in 2005. And as a community, we celebrated her life, we celebrated her death, we put her to bed. And I've missed her ever since. I constantly miss Myfanwy. She was my wonderful inspirer. She inspired me so much in this particular world. And it just came to me. I'd got myself all upset in the pandemic. It was all very traumatic at the morgue. And I went and sat in a cupboard to have a little cry, and just like center myself. And in that cupboard, I sat and thought, I'm going to write a Druidry book to Myfanwy. I'm going to have her in my mind, and I'm going to write it to her as if I'm telling her, she's been dead for nearly 20 years, telling her about what Druidry is from the perspective of somebody 20 years in her future, and somebody who has been doing it for a while now. And I just wanted to tell her about it and hope that she would be proud of it. And I tend to do that with all of my books anyway. I tend to have somebody in mind, and then I write it for that person, as if it's a letter to that individual. So I really enjoyed the process because I was able to go back to the very basics of my Druid practice and what I perceive Druidry to be, and hence why it's a complete introduction, if you like. But although I also think that there are things in there that a seasoned practitioner of Druidry might also be inspired by, I hope there is anyway. And so that's what I did. I sat down, I went to Finland. I like to go to Finland in January to sit in the dark because it's polar night up there. So lovely. I rent a beautiful cabin deep in the forest, peace and quiet, for a month. And I sat and wrote this book for Myfanwy. And then I came home and I fiddled with it and sent it to my editor, and they loved it. So I was really pleased that they really liked it. But I really wanted to offer elements of that wisdom tradition to people who are brand new at it, because there are Witchcraft 101 and basic introductory guides to folk magic and witchcraft practices all over the world. There's so many. And I have hundreds of them, I'm sure, and love all of them. But when it comes to Druidry, there's not an awful lot of titles that really address it. The point is like, well, what is it? What is a druid? What does a druid do? And how does a druid do it? So I wanted to go back to that because, again, like a broken record, going back to my friend Mavanwi would always ask me if we were chatting about anything in the spiritual world. She would always ask, what's the point of that? Why did you say that? What's the point? And it would sometimes catch me off guard. I'm like, oh gosh, is there a point? And that constant questioning caused me to constantly scratch at what I was saying and why I was saying it. And ultimately, I think it boiled down to, well, what is a druid and what's the point of one? And that's what I wanted to address and offer, my opinion of the answer to that.
I'm so glad you said that, because I really got that on reading it. And I was so happy because I don't know about you, but like I've read so many books on Druidry and it seems to be like a constant digression. So you're like going, okay, and you're waiting. And then it's almost like, see next book for answer.
Right. I did not want to be one of those books.
Yeah. No, you weren't. No,
You
it
know?
really got down to it. And it really talked about, the nitty gritty basically. And I love that. And you also gave lip service to being a druid today and what that meant. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Very much so. Like I think I said in a previous comment about how Druidry is a response. It's in response to what is happening in your square mile, in your locality, in your country, in your culture. And it's finding elements of sagacity and wisdom within yourself and inspiration to be able to enchant and inspire the world around you. And I often joke at the end of a presentation or a talk or a workshop that what I'm doing is spreading a DTI, or a druid transmitted infection, and that a DTI, the infection, is awen, is inspiration. And there's no cure for inspiration, because once you're inspired, you have to then go and inspire someone else. You have no option, you have no choice. If you're inspired, you must share it. And people will either go on Facebook and they'll be like, oh my gosh, this happened to me today. And it's like, and then somebody else will think, oh, that's amazing, that's fabulous. So inspiration is this wave that progresses from one individual through into 1,000 people or more. And I think that's very much at the heart of what a druid does. A druid inspires people to be the best, wisest version of themselves they can be. But that the progression, the finding, and the expression of wisdom isn't something that ever ends. And there might be days where you feel really, really wise and you've done something really sagacious and wise, but the next day you've done something really bloody stupid, and daft. And that's okay. You're still a human being. We're all flawed human beings, but it's the striving for wisdom, the doing of wisdom, if you like, which is, to me, is at the heart of the Druid tradition, to be oak wise. So being a Druid today for me is being a voice for awen, for inspiration in the world, because sometimes this world is a really difficult place to live in. I mean, look what's happening here now in Europe. We have wars, and you think, gosh, have we not learned anything as human beings? Why is this all happening? And it's because the wisdom is falling out of people, of communities, of societies. It's wisdom that's falling out. If we're able to respond to situations wisely, then we wouldn't have wars. We wouldn't have these turmoils and conflicts. So it's up to us as wisdom keepers, if you like, to ensure that the world has wisdom in it. And there's nothing much I can do personally for the war in Ukraine, but I can still transmit my own piece of wisdom and inspiration. And you never know where that's going to end up. You never know. It's that adage of a butterfly flaps its wings in Tibet, and a storm happens in another part of the world. We never know how far the influence of inspiration can get or can go in a way that imbibes the world with wisdom. And so even when I don't feel particularly wise, I will go and read or listen to a podcast or listened to a radio show from somebody who is wise at that moment in time to bring me back to it, to bring me back to the stream of Awen, of sagaciousness, you know. So thank you for saying that. It really it always lifts my heart when someone says, I've read your book and I really enjoyed it. And that is nectar to an author's ears.
Well, I mean, I really do mean it, because like so often I've read books where, you know, it was wonderful. They're great books. I'm not knocking them, and they're great writers. But oftentimes I'm like, well, that's nice. What does this have to do with me and being a druid right now? And so
Right,
often you wrote something that was applicable. And I was like, well, thank you very much for finally doing this.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. So because it's a complete introduction, there's the implication there that there'll be something else. So watch this space.
Well, that reminds me of my next question. What's next for you?
So the Book of Druidry is next. So that comes out in July in the United States and the end of August in the British Isles and Europe. And immediately after that, which I think comes out either the end of August, beginning of September, is the Yule Tarot. I'm a tarot fan. I'm a big tarot head. It's one of those things that I discovered in my youth, you know, as a teenager, and I've been absolutely obsessed with them ever since. So I do an awful lot of work with the tarot daily. So the Celtic Tarot, which I worked with Chris Down to illustrate in 2018, I think. So that's been out for a few years. And
that's a lovely deck, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So I wanted to do
something
about the festive season. And so the major arcana of the Yule Tarot incorporates some of, not all of them, because there's so many, and there's only 22 cards in the majors. So I've got a lot of archetypes in there, archetypes of the season, to express the major arcana. And the minor arcana is the very human connection that we have to the winter solstice, to Christmas time, to, you know, all of those holidays that happen at that time of year. And I wanted it to look like a children's illustrated book, to be very whimsical and pretty and Dickensian to an extent. And Erin Brown, who I worked with, she lives in upstate New York. So I designed it and conceptualized it and wrote the book. And then I worked with Erin to get all the cards sorted. And she's done a fabulous job. It's very whimsical. And then
that sounds lovely.
Oh, it's so pretty. I'm absolutely chuffed to bits with it. I can't wait to read it. So I'm hoping it'll be here before long, you know, that the author copies, because I always get those way before it comes out. And then the next one after that will be the Bee Tarot. Bees as in buzzy bees, which is very, very beautiful. I'm very proud of all of these things. I can't wait to hold them in my hand. And because we keep bees here at home, my partner's a beekeeper. Nice. So they've always been a part of our lives, really. And I love the things with bees. The things that I love about bees is that you cannot help but be connected to the animistic principle in the world by having just the minutest relationship with bees. Having, even if it's a distant relationship with bees, just observing them, watching them, or actively being a beekeeper will completely change your life, because you can't help but see that there's a much bigger picture in the natural world, and they express it so beautifully, so articulately. And so I'm hoping that some of that will come across in this new deck. And then, so I'm currently also writing a new book, but that was a secret for now.
All right. Well, Kristoffer, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I've enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you. It's been really lovely. I hope we get to have you on here again.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you very much.
That was my conversation with Druid and author Kristoffer Hughes. His new book, The Book of Druidry, is available for pre-order via the link in the bio. Next week, we'll be speaking with Ivo Dominguez Jr., who has written Keys to Perception, Practical Astrology for Witches and Pagans, Casting Sacred Space, Spirit Speak, and more. Join us then to hear this conversation. We want to thank Llewellyn Worldwide for providing this book and author for this interview. Until next time, bright blessings.